When the media discusses the war on terror, the focus is primarily on the Middle East. But one Latin American country has been in America's crosshairs since its socialist revolution in 1959, Cuba. Somehow, this Caribbean island nation has managed to consistently stay on the U.S. terror watch list for the last 32 years. In fact, the State Department iterated again just last year that Cuba is one of 4 state sponsors of terrorism. This, of course, is despite the U.S. government's own admission that there is no evidence to suggest that the Cuban government has ever provided weapons or training to terrorist groups. But the outdated resentment for the Castro government is perfectly exemplified through the case of 5 Cuban nationals arrested in Miami in 1998. Antonio Guerrero, Fernando Gonzales, Rene Gonzales, Gerardo Gonzales, and Ramon Lavinino are better known as the Cuban Five. You see, in response to a rain of terrorist attacks in Cuba, some of which the U.S. government supported, Castro assigned the 5 men to monitor anti-Cuban groups in Miami in an effort to prevent future terrorist attacks against the country. These men, however, were arrested by U.S. authorities, charged with espionage, and sentenced to serve life in prison. Since then, there's been an ongoing campaign to free the Cuban Five. But just today, Cuban Five member Fernando Gonzales was released from prison in Arizona. This makes him the 2nd member of the group to be set free. So joining me now to talk about Gonzales' release and the fate of the remaining 3 members of the Cuban Five, I'm joined by RT correspondent Nicholas Sanchez O'Donovan from Miami. What is up, Nicholas?
How you doing, Abby Martin? Nice to be with you.
Thank you. So considering how this has been a very contentious issue for quite some time in Cuba and the U.S., has there been any statement from the Cuban government regarding Fernando Gonzales' release?
Well, actually, the first tweet I received this morning was from La Habana. It wasn't, though, an official reaction, but it was a very special one. It was Rene Gonzales, the first member of the Cuban Five to be released. It was around 8 or 9 a.m. Miami time, and what he said was that finally Fernando is out of prison after serving an unfair 15-year sentence. And that tweet basically shows the feeling of the Cuban people. Officially, the only thing we've heard for the moment is that there will be a concert held next Saturday to honor the Cuban Five. We know that Rene will be there. What we still don't know is if Fernando Gonzales will be there. Now, I'm sure that when it comes, the reaction will be obviously one of welcoming a hero back home. Cuba has always said that the group of the Cuban Five were never responsible for any sort of violence, and that they never tried to infiltrate the U.S. Army, never targeted U.S. interests, and that their only objective was to, well, basically prevent future terrorist attacks, as you just mentioned. Terrorist attacks that, by the way, were plotted here in Miami during the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Anyways, what you can expect is a very warm welcome for Fernando Gonzales once he sets foot back in Cuba.
I'm sure there will be. Well-deserved. Rene Gonzales, who you mentioned, was released in 2011, not immediately allowed to return to Cuba. Is that the same case, or is it unknown at this point?
No, it's a completely different case. The main difference here is that Rene Gonzales was a U.S. citizen, and that obviously changes the whole, let's say, legal post-release scenario. No, you can't just deport one of your own citizens, plus U.S. citizens aren't allowed to travel to Cuba. So what happened? Well, Rene was released on parole for 3 years, down in 2011. He was allowed to return to Cuba only for his father's funeral back in April 22nd of 2013. That was the initial deal. After that, he was required to return back here to Florida, but a federal judge, well, he just ruled that he can stay in Cuba as long as he renounces to his U.S. citizenship. For Fernando Gonzales, the story is completely different. I mean, he doesn't hold a U.S. passport, so he was immediately deported from Arizona to La Habana.
And how many years left did the other 3 men have to serve?
Well, that depends. They are, first of all, we have to say, well, they are very different sentences. No, they're much higher. Initially, for instance, Antonio Guerrero and Ramon Lavinino were looking at life in prison, and Gerardo Hernandez had 2 life sentences. Now, after reduction, Guerrero is still looking at 22 years in prison, Lavinino at 30 years, and Gerardo Hernandez is still facing life behind bars. And honestly, I can't imagine that at this point in time they're going to get any further reductions. The only way that this could happen is a drastic change in Cuban-US relations, and at this point, well, honestly, I can't see this happening. Actually, the Obama administration has stated on numerous occasions that they will never accept a spy swap agreement. So for the moment, unfortunately, I can't see the 3 members remaining here in the US joining Rene and Fernando anytime soon. No?
Yeah, quite unfortunate, especially since the U.S. and Israel are the only states to consistently uphold that embargo against Cuba. I don't really see that being different anytime soon. But in 2010, Nicholas, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, through FOIA requests, found that the U.S. government was indeed paying journalists to smear the Cuban Five during their trial, which is illegal. I mean, why hasn't that information played a factor in overturning these sentences?
Well, it hasn't, because obviously it's not an information that you want to have out there if you are in the US. And obviously now we do know that there was some sort of bribing, no, to journalists down here in Miami. Obviously, I wasn't here at that time, but down in 1998, we did see thousands and thousands of federal dollars going down to journalists just to, let's say, inflate the story, to try and spin it towards not only the jury, no, that finally found them guilty for those 26 counts, but also the public eye. Here in Miami, as you well know, well, it is a stronghold for the Cuban exile, and obviously if you have the main media here in Miami inflating the story and giving a negative view about the story, well, obviously it's going to be much easier to finally, well, convict these 5 Cubans, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope that we can put some pressure. I mean, I don't really see, is there anything else that we can do to help the members to be released early? Nicholas, we have about 20 seconds left.
Well, the thing is, it's not only up to us. The thing is, it's up to the Cubans themselves. And we have seen the Cubans inside Cuba and outside, even here in Miami, supporting the release of the Cuban Five. We already have 2 of them back in La Habana. There's 3 left. 2 of them could be out in less than 5-6 years, but the case is there's still one that's facing life in prison here in the US, and all pressure is little just to try and get him back home.
Thank you so much, Nicholas Sanchez O'Donovan. I really appreciate you breaking it down. That's our show, you guys. Join me again tomorrow, and I break the set all over again.